open source is legal, is technically defined by licenses. What I will argue is, and we've heard that in the first session, is that communities are an important aspect of open source. And I'm using plural here because I believe that's important. So communities, collaboration, and the purpose and identities those communities have. And communities, the concept of communities equally underlies the concept of sustainability. When we talk about sustainability, the first thing that usually comes to mind is environmental sustainability. But really, sustainability has different aspects, and usually there is three that are commonly used: environmental sustainability, economical sustainability, and social sustainability. And how do communities factor into those? Obviously, on the environmental side, if a single country, even if the entire European Union takes measures against climate change, environmental pollution, that is important, but it's not sufficient. And equally, our economies have become broader, global, and so the communities at different levels are key, and social and communities doesn't need any explanation. So open source and sustainability have a lot in common. Let's dive a little into the different aspects and see where they can play together. Environmental sustainability begets a question, which is, what if we could reduce electronic waste? There is tons of electronic waste generated every day. And part of it is our life cycles of hardware and software. In fashion, there is the concept of fast fashion, which is interesting to put it politely. In IT, in consumer electronics, we do face a challenge around planned obsolescence. And I'd like to make a call to action here, which I believe is important on the political scene. I believe that requires some political steps, because open source can help us reduce the life cycle of hardware. Why? How? Well, due to the big communities and diverse communities, open source is circling in space around the Earth. Open source has been to Mars. So economies of power, etc., are really important. And also there's open source contributors in many areas that don't actually have the ability to buy the latest and greatest hardware every 2 or 3 years. Similarly, what if we could reduce power and other resource consumptions? We can. Engineering in general, but in particular open source, is actually really good about energy-aware engineering. And the flip side, energy-aware operations. One of SUSE's customer, Cardano Group, actually managed to reduce their energy cost by 75+%. How did they do that? They powered down non-production services overnight. What you need for something like that is really operations that are effective and efficient and smooth, because powering down usually is easy, but you don't want your colleagues to come into the office or into virtual office in the morning and then spend literally 1, 2, 3 hours to start up things and connect things. So focusing on engineering, on the creation of products, focusing on the life cycle, but also on the operational aspects will be key here. Second, and economic sustainability. Open source, as has become pretty clear, I believe, offers vast economies of scale. And one approach that I've seen work again and again is distributing the efforts, sharing a base, working together in as wide a way as possible, on a solid, secure, rich base, and then adapt to local requirements or differentiate as a business. COVID-19 was mentioned today already. And in fact, the Austrian COVID-19 app that I'm using when I want to go to the theater or in a yoga class is based on an open source app that the Swiss government has developed. The German COVID-19 app is open source as well. So there is prior art. The question I'd ask is, how many projects, how many apps do we actually have and need in Europe? So could there be more sharing, more leveraging, and then local adaptation? I believe an elephant in the room, and that is really important, is open source and the connection to digital sovereignty. Open source cannot be canceled. Open source cannot be canceled. No government, no business that decides not to proceed a certain product line any longer, whatever geopolitical changes can affect open source projects to the extent that they can end the project. Now, just to be clear, I'm not proposing that Europe does everything on our own. Absolutely not. Let's work with partners around the globe. Let's work with communities, universities everywhere. This is a safety net. This is a security belt. Should anything bad happen, should there be an export control over a trade dispute, should there be political changes, should there be whatever changes, once it's open source, we can take it, we can continue it and evolve it. So it breaks dependencies we may have. Open source also lowers barriers of reuse and collaboration. However, if you can't find it, you can't contribute. It doesn't exist. And so while there is good progress around open source in the public sector in Europe, sometimes those projects are really hard to find, really hard to contribute. And then it becomes open source thrown over the fence, as I call it, which is it's open source technically, comes with an open source license, but there's no community around it. And what we've seen over the last couple of years is open source is happening at two layers. One is the code, and the other layer is the tooling around the code. It's central services where you report issues, where we discuss features and everything. And that is very limited in terms of footprint in Europe. So I would argue it would be worthwhile for Europe to consider going for a common European platform. Maybe first something as a directory to ensure discoverability, but could be going even further. And last but not least, open source is about openness. It's about transparency, and transparency begets security. There has been a long history of debates. Is open source more secure? Is it less secure? Does the openness actually hurt? In my experience, openness does not hurt. Rather to the contrary, you have researchers, you have volunteers, you have different businesses focusing on the same. If there is an issue, addressing it together. And we have proven it. We managed to achieve common criteria certification at the EL4 plus level, which is pretty much the highest you can do with a general purpose operating system. However, also here I've got the call to action, and it is most of the certifications that we are seeing, that we are undergoing, come from North America, which is fine. Again, let's collaborate across. However, it might make sense to create more of a European identity and impact here. So establish and evolve, collaborating by default, our own or accredited certifications, and make sure, which is something I've been told is not fully the case yet, if one EU member country certifies something, there is accreditation across the board. And just for the record, public money, public code, and let's prefer open source for public tenders, not at any cost, not under whatever conditions, but if open source is a good enough match, often it will be a better match anyway, then give it a fair chance. The third aspect of sustainability is social sustainability. And true open source is about collaboration. And that's where I'm seeing we have room for improvement. Participating in open source projects requires good, if not excellent, communication skills. Open source has the advantage of bringing people together, but it also means you're sitting in one room usually, or even in one virtual room with one manager, one HR department. You're distributed globally across time zones. You may or will never meet in person. And I find, full disclosure, our education system's a bit lacking there. So in particular, if you look at technical education, strengthening the communication skills that are taught, making this an impact, making this an effort is something I recommend. Similarly, open source is a different paradigm, and so it requires a different way of looking at things. But there is a richness, the fact that communications, communities working together is, if anything, more important with open source, makes it a good training ground, even in basic education. And Bavaria, with Baycode, actually is leading the way here. That's an initiative where students, pupils actually are exposed to computer programming at a very high level. Can be also web page design, things like that, and open source. And I believe from, not necessarily from the cradle, but from basic education to higher level education, if you introduce people to the concept and the concepts around that, like communications, collaborations, and practice them, we can make a difference. Last but not least, something that's very, very dear to my heart, open source and diversity and inclusion also go together, because open source allows people to contribute without a high barrier of entrance. You can contribute from your living room, you can contribute from completely different time zones. And I have the pleasure and privilege to work at the company where diversity and inclusion are driven from the very top. This is a big priority for us at SUSE. And I can tell you, not only is diversity and inclusion the right thing to do, it also makes business sense. Purely from a business perspective, it makes sense, because you widen the pool of people who can join, the diversity of thoughts, the diversity of contributions, perspectives, just creates a much better working environment and improves the outcome. So what's better than that, right? Something that's good for the business and is the right thing to do. So we have seen open source is at the base, is at the core of many movements, many political changes these days. And it's at the core and can be at the core of sustainability and digital sovereignty, if we allow it to, if we give it a fair chance, if we support it. And in case you've been wondering what the word Kula on my title slide meant, well, that's just Sanskrit and it means community. Thank you.